läuft die Veranstaltung unter dem Titel Salongespräche meets Planetary Lecture Volume 4. Und zu Gast haben wir heute die Sozialkritikerin und Autorin Minna Salami hier zu meiner Rechten, zu der ich gleich noch ein paar Worte sage. Wie ihr wisst, findet die Veranstaltung ja heute auf Englisch statt, aber ich sage kurz ein paar Worte auf Deutsch. Später in der Diskussion können wir es auch ein bisschen mischen. Ich versuche dann mal zu übersetzen, wenn ihr Übersetzung braucht. Genau. Also, nochmal kurz zum Kontext. Mein Name ist Lisa Bauer, falls ihr mich nicht kennt. Ich repräsentiere das Panel on Planetary Thinking an der JLU Gießen. Wir sind ein Think Tank, der sich mit Nachhaltigkeitsfragen und allen anderen Fragen rund um den Planeten und die menschlichen Gesellschaften auseinandersetzt und eine ganzheitliche Perspektive in der Hinsicht vorantreibt in der Uni. Genau, und die Vortragsreihe, in der der Vortrag heute stattfindet, das ist die Planetary Lecture Series. Dafür laden wir einmal oder zweimal pro Semester Expertinnen ein und die Reihe haben wir letztes Jahr gestartet und wir versuchen die Inhalte, die unsere Rednerinnen bereitstellen, auch einem breiteren Publikum außerhalb von Gießen zugänglich zu machen. Daher wird es heute aufgezeichnet mit freundlicher Unterstützung vom Stadttheater. Dafür bedanken wir uns herzlich. Und das heißt aber auch, dass die Kommentare aufgezeichnet werden. Also wenn ihr nicht möchtet, dass eure Stimme auf der Aufnahme zu sehen ist, dann sagt uns einfach Bescheid. Vorne liegt auch eine Liste mit euren, da könnt ihr die E-Mail-Adressen eintragen, wenn ihr möchtet. Und dann können wir das auch ausschneiden, wenn irgendjemand damit uncomfortable ist. Okay. Und nochmal kurz zur Orientierung. Also Minna Salami wird ungefähr 45 Minuten sprechen. Danach haben wir Zeit für die Diskussion gemeinsam. Wir haben auch eine Diskutantin, Adenike, die ich euch später noch vorstelle, die das Ganze eröffnen wird. Genau, aber nun endlich zu unserer Rednerin. Minna Salami, hier zu meiner Rechten, ist feministische Autorin und Sozialkritikerin, habe ich schon gesagt. Und sie ist momentan Fellow am The New Institute, das ist ein außeruniversitäres Forschungszentrum in Hamburg. Und unser Geschäftsführer Radicalness ist dort auch gerade Fellow und daher kennen die beiden sich und er hat das Event heute initiiert, das sitzt da hinten. Genau. Und dort... Sorry dafür. Für die Aufmerksamkeit. Genau, und sie setzt sich dort unter anderem mit Black Feminist Theory auseinander, mit zeitgenössischem afrikanischem Denken, der sogenannten Polycrisis und auch der Politik der Wissensproduktion im Allgemeineren. Darum wird es unter anderem heute auch noch gehen. Viel wichtiger vielleicht jedoch, sie ist Autorin von einem Buch, was auch im Mattes und Seitz Verlag 2021 erschienen ist. Das trägt den deutschen Titel Sinnliches Wissen, eine schwarze feministische Perspektive für alle. Und in diesem Buch untersucht sie, wie wir universelle Konzepte mit Hilfe eines sogenannten Black Feminist Frameworks neu interpretieren können. Und da geht sie auch noch tiefer rein. Im Jahr 2024, also nächstes Jahr, wird ein neues Buch von ihr erscheinen mit dem Titel Can Feminism Be African? Das erscheint im HarperCollins Verlag. Und dort geht sie nochmal tiefer in die Kernthematiken eines afrikanischen Feminismus rein. Sie hat auch für ganz viele unterschiedliche Medien geschrieben, und zwar für den Guardian, für Project Syndicate, Al Jazeera und The Philosopher. Und außerdem hat sie einen Blog gegründet, der nennt sich Miss Afropolitan und der hat über 1 Million Leserinnen und Leser erreicht. Und noch dazu spricht sie häufig auf verschiedenen internationalen Foren, wie sie hat TED-Talks gehalten, an der Uni Oxford gesprochen, der Yale University, der Oxford Union, der Cambridge Union, auch im Europäischen Parlament oder an der Singularity University in Kalifornien. Also sie war wirklich schon an sehr vielen unterschiedlichen Orten der Welt und hat dort gesprochen. Leben tut sie in London und dort hat sie Politikwissenschaften und Gender Studies studiert und hat sich dort auch schon auf feministische Theorie spezialisiert. Sie sitzt außerdem im Rat des Royal Institute of Philosophies und ist in den Vorständen der African Feminist Initiative an der Pennsylvania State University und noch ein paar anderen Gremien. Was jetzt aber auch noch besonders spannend ist, ist, dass sie letzte Woche als eines der Mitglieder des Club of Romes ernannt wurde. Der Club of Rome ist sozusagen einer der Vordenker des Feldes des planetaren Denkens, was wir ja auch im Panel vorantreiben. Und wie ich vorhin schon gesagt habe, wir sind ein Think Tank an der Uni Gießen. Wir versuchen verschiedene Perspektiven zu ganz unterschiedlichen Themen zusammenzubringen, aus unterschiedlichen Disziplinen über Problematiken und über Prozesse, die das Erdsystem und menschliche Gesellschaften betreffen, zu sprechen. Und Minna wird heute diese feministische Perspektive reinbringen, was eine Perspektive ist, die gar nicht mal so oft mit diesem planetaren Denken bisher in Verbindung gebracht wurde. Und daher sind wir besonders froh, dass wir sie gewinnen konnten, weil es dann dadurch natürlich eine besonders wichtige Perspektive ist, über die wir uns freuen, heute mehr zu lernen. Okay, aber jetzt habe ich wirklich, glaube ich, genug Worte verloren. Ich würde dann jetzt Sie alle bitten, mit mir zusammen Minna Salami zu begrüßen.
Guten Abend. Ich habe viele verstanden, aber nicht alles. I'm in the process of learning German. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you to the panel for inviting me. Thank you to all of you who have come. It's a little bit strange because I guess it's a lecture that normally takes place in an academic setting. There's a respondent. Then we're sitting here and everybody's having drinks, so I hope that it won't be too much in the academic spirit, what I've prepared. But since we are in quite an intimate setting, feel free to, everybody just relax, even if what we're discussing is, of course, of an academic nature. So, what I'm going to do is I'll just go through my lecture, and then we'll have a respondent, and then you can ask questions afterwards. And the central question that motivates this lecture is, what can feminism, and specifically the Black feminist theory of intersectionality, say about the planetary crisis? And to respond to this question in a satisfactory way, I'm going to break it down into different sections, quite a big question, and I'm going to look at the question both metaphysically and socio-politically. So the first section will address what I refer to as the ontological triple error, and I will break this down. In the second section, I will address the socio-political consequences of the ontological triple error. And then thirdly, I'll introduce Black feminism, intersectionality, and what kinds of interventions they make in the previous discussions. And that will bring me to then share with you this idea that is in the title of this lecture, Planetary Intersectionality. Starting with what I refer to as the ontological triple error then. And basically, it has to do with what was described in the synopsis for this lecture. That we have been pretending for a long time that we are masters of the universe and of our destiny. And the dominant approach to knowledge about the nature of reality, nature, and existence, so in short, to ontology, has been a detrimental mix of confusion, hubris, and exploitation. We've constructed the world on the false idea that reality is entirely of a material nature, firstly. Secondly, that this supposedly material nature reality is incommensurable. And thirdly, we live under the epistemological illusion that we can understand reality only by measuring and quantifying it. Sorry, my notes are tiny, so I'm just going to increase this one. Okay. So, to explain this ontological triple error a little bit further and more concretely, I'm going to use an image. So imagine that all of reality and the totality of existence were a sandbox. Everything that is observable, experienced, or that is physical, including all matter and all of the laws and principles that govern the interactions between matter and energy, all the galaxies, all the biological systems, the subatomic particles, everything were a sandbox. Now picture that there's a little girl playing in the sandbox, and a little boy comes along and they decide to play together. And at this point, the girl has built three sandcastles, let's say. And so the boy joins her, and although they've decided that they're not in a competitive race, once the little boy realizes that he has built 19 sandcastles and the girl is still just on her fourth, he jumps up and puts his hands up in the air and declares himself the winner. And he says that he's the king of the sandbox. And the little girl tries to explain that because she wasn't aware that they were in a competition, she wasn't rushing to build sandcastles. And instead she was fully immersed in the sensuous experience of playing. She tells the little boy that while he may try to decide the fate of his sandcastles, he cannot be king of the sandbox, because what is inside the sandbox extends beyond the tangible and observable sandcastles. So the sandbox also contains abstract, metaphysical frameworks such as language, thoughts, subjective emotions, and consciousness. And then, of course, there are also the senses in the sandbox, so all of the textures and the sounds and smells, which of course, can be measured in some sense, but the boy insists that his sandcastles are the totality, they encompass the totality of reality, and that this is furthermore objectively the case because it can be measured, and the quantity, the 19 sandcastles that he erected, can be measured. That the metaphorical sandcastles, rather than the sandbox itself, are what constitutes reality, is metaphorical to the ontological triple error that I'm referring to. It is where we have come to believe that reality is that which we can measure, and that anything that cannot be measured, therefore, does not constitute reality. And this belief, in return, creates all kinds of problems, of course, because if something needs to be material to be real, then everything that is not easily measurable is either neglected or forced into some rigid box where we can quantify it and where it doesn't really belong. So, for example, we're seeing that now with the many conversations about how we're soon going to have conscious AI, by leading philosophers and technical engineers and so on. And this is really bizarre and ludicrous because we actually don't even know what consciousness is, let alone that we are able to materialize it and measure it. And this means, of course, that consciousness cannot be reproduced materially or technologically through substances such as rubber or metal or silicone or wires or all the sort of substances that are put into AI. So that is the ontological triple error, and it's really an error which has very dangerous impacts on the planet. And this leads me to the second part of what I want to discuss, which is the socio-political consequences of the ontological triple error. Because if I were exploring these questions from a strictly philosophical position, I could continue to focus on these kinds of metaphysical assumptions which have shaped modern thought, and of course on their effect on the planet. But because I am a feminist social critic, the feminist tradition in which I root my work means that I am interested in observing the socio-political and ethical consequences of these flawed metaphysical assumptions and sort of finding a way to discuss those two things in tandem. So in the context of the planetary crisis, bringing in the tradition of feminist critical observation leads me to the central argument of this talk, which is that the planetary crisis is at root the result of a combination of the ontological triple error on the one hand, which I described in the beginning, and let me just repeat what I define that as. So the ontological triple error is the false idea that reality is entirely of a material nature, firstly, and secondly, that the supposedly material nature of reality is incommensurable. Thirdly, it is that we can understand reality only by measuring and quantifying it. So the combination of this with the second root cause of the planetary crisis, which is equally deceptive and delusional, and which a feminist observation brings me to, is the idea that power is the currency with which to measure this allegedly material nature of existence. So in other words, power is the instrument with which we are, quote unquote, competing for a piece of reality. And so to return to the sandbox image, it would be to say that power is to amass and acquire as many sandcastles as possible at all costs. Inevitably, the combination of the ontological triple error and the abuse of power leads to systems that, whether they are economic, educational, political, social, are systems which view nature, both human and non-human nature that is, as a warehouse to endlessly exploit by those who have power. And these are typically men and or white European heritage people. And so this is why, in my work, I refer to this dominant worldview as Europatriarchal. And the Europatriarchal paradigm is a systemic constructing of reality as though it were a warehouse from where resources can be harnessed and quantification or tools of quantification can be used to bend the whole universe into this enterprise where we can harness materiality in order to maximize profit. But wherever there is an abuse of power, there is, of course, a crisis. And the discussion about the planetary crisis is therefore fundamentally a discussion and a question of power. And so I will now shift to a discussion about intersectionality, which addresses this question of power. So, since its inception in the 1970s as an official school of thought, Black feminism has always been about understanding the multiple sort of interlocking ways that societal structures exacerbate the oppression of Black women specifically. And like all feminist theory, Black feminist thought has focused on the systemic nature of power structures. But Black feminist thought has specifically highlighted the ways in which racism, sexism, and often classism come together, intersect, and compound in order to create, not in order to, but inevitably then end up creating very unique challenges for Black women. And in recent decades, this foundational impetus of Black feminist thought has been theorized with the label intersectionality. Intersectionality is maybe a term that most of you are familiar with. Have people heard of intersectionality? Yeah. It was coined in 1989 by a black feminist scholar called Kimberly Crenshaw. And she coined it as a critique of the sort of single-axis feminist and black anti-racist frameworks that ignored black women's experiences by treating gender and race as exclusive categories. So in the feminist space, gender was seen as one issue to treat, and in black movements, race was the exclusive category. And instead of this, Kimberly Crenshaw argued that race and gender were inseparable factors when it came to the negation of black women's agency, and that they constantly were intersecting. So she described intersectionality as follows, quote, "Discrimination, like traffic through an intersection, may flow in one direction and it may flow in another. If an accident happens in an intersection, it can be caused by cars traveling from any number of directions, and sometimes from all of them. Similarly, if a black woman is harmed because she is in the intersection, her injury could result from sex discrimination or race discrimination," end quote. So ultimately what Crenshaw is saying is that the sum of race discrimination and sex discrimination together are more impactful than each one separately. And since Kimberly Crenshaw coined intersectionality in the 1980s, black feminist thought has expanded to include other categories now in considering intersectionality. So categories such as sexuality and class, as I mentioned, also disability and others. Intersectionality has had a remarkable impact on not only feminist scholarship, but it has also become widely adapted, and it is used in different geographical, topical, and methodological settings. So it sort of lends itself well to very many possible situations that humans face, including politics, governance, education. The German government has just, in their newly minted feminist foreign policy, called it an intersectional, what's the exact phrase they use? An intersectional approach. So, this theory has really migrated quite broadly. And from these descriptions of intersectionality that I've provided, it's, I think, already possible to extrapolate that there is a relationship between intersectionality and the planetary crisis. So intersectionality describes the unique predicament of multiple systems, of multiple systemic oppressions, and the planetary crisis likewise describes the unique predicament of systemic crises overlapping. So let me again explain this with an image, and use this image to sort of sketch out what I mean by planetary intersectionality. So if we think of this image of a black woman at the intersection of an accident, and that intersection blurs the lines of oppression because the cars are coming from all directions. This same image is also useful for thinking about the ways in which our planet is harmed by multiple and simultaneous dangers. So if you replace the image of a black woman standing at the intersection in your mind's eye with our planet in the center of the crossroads. So where the black woman finds herself being hit from a crash of sexism in one lane and racism in another lane, or homophobia or class oppression, our planet is also in a corroding intersection of harmful systems. But the systems here are things like capitalism is one lane, capitalism, cars coming crashing, consumerism, hierarchism, which of course also contains social oppression such as sexism and so on. But it's these sort of systemic patterns that are all crashing into the planet at the same time. And on top of that, because these are systems that we can try to assess and to quantify and measure anyway. But on top of that, there are also metaphysical systems that are crashing into the planet. And because of the ontological triple error, we can't see that our materialist ontology is extracting the thing that the planet needs in order to survive, or the things, the resources. And so, if we return to the central question that I said motivates this lecture in the beginning, namely, what can feminism, and specifically the Black feminist theory of intersectionality, say about the planetary crisis? It is the following. It is that Black feminist thought reconceptualizes the planet through intersectionality. So, through this model of planetary intersectionality, the planet emerges as agentic, meaning that it is something that acts, and that acts in relationship with other agentic entities. So with other planets, with humans, non-humans, matter and non-matter. And these agentic relationships are impacted by the planet and vice versa. The planet is also impacted by them. This, of course, is the same case for the Black woman at the intersection. So both the relationships that are of an abstract nature and those of a socio-political nature impact Black women's lives. The knowledge that we are consuming in a sort of abstract field, which can be so destructive for the agency of Black women, as well as the actual structural, material deprivations and disenfranchisements that often impact Black women's lives collectively. So you could say that planetary intersectionality is not only intersectional within within a specific group, it is also intrasectional. And then it is also intersectional between entities where the non-human illuminates the impact of metaphysics and materiality on the human and vice versa. So looking at the example of Black women is illuminating something about the planet, which is a non-human entity, and looking at the planet at the intersectional corrosion is illuminating something about the Black female intersectionality. But most importantly, maybe what planetary intersectionality does is it allows us to envision how a symbiosis of relationships between agents can be transformative of both ontological, so of metaphysical, and of material outcomes. So if we start to think of the ways in which we can address the oppression of Black women or of other marginalized groups, based not only on race or sex, but also on other factors, such as class and disability and so on, we also are simultaneously engaging in a kind of symbiotic and transformative understanding of how the planet, how we can care better for the planet. If we lived on another planet, we probably would continue to develop this deceptive and delusional myth about reality under the guise of objective truth. So, is that? So we may continue to believe the little boy over the little girl, and I do love little boys. I'm not using this example to sort of point a finger and say that boys are patriarchal from childhood or something. But yeah, we continue to believe that in this image, the little boy over the little girl. But of course, we have reached a point on this planet where we can no longer deceive ourselves. And so we find ourselves forced to deal with the reality of climate change. And one by one delusion at a time, we also are being forced to see how the materialist worldview is tied to Europatriarchal and hierarchical forms of oppression. And of course, we don't have another planet, at least not yet. And so the planetary crisis also forces us to once again address who shapes and defines reality, and who shapes and defines within this reality that they have already shaped and defined the direction of the planet and its human and non-human inhabitants. But the urgency also provides us with a true chance to do something that we've never done before. And this is going to sound even more idealistic than perhaps the talk has sounded thus far, but I will end on this note. It gives us the chance to look for the truth in a way that we haven't done before, which is in a way that isn't tied to power. And I know that I've spoken very little about the impermanence and the sort of radical simpleness that was mentioned in the title, but that this is the thing that I'm pointing to, this quest for truth that isn't tied to the quest for power, because it is ultimately very simple, but profound and lasting. And it is perfectly encapsulated in a quote by Deepak Chopra that I came across recently. And I'll end with his quote. He said, "Seek the company of those who are looking for the truth, and run from those who claim to have found it." Thank you.
I'd like to welcome you to the stage as well. Thank you so much, Minna, for this lecture. It's really wonderful, and I think it worked really well in this beautiful surrounding here. And now, before we start and dive into the discussion, I just say a few words about our discussant, Adenike Oladoso, who is sitting on the right side over there. Adenike is an eco-feminist and dedicated fighter for climate justice from Nigeria. And she's also currently a fellow at our panel. So she is working on a project where she's documenting the shrinking of Lake Chad, which is a massive lake that supplies the livelihood of millions of people. And you can learn more about her project in July when there's an exhibition opposite of the street in Kunsthalle. And she's actually she's a well-known fighter for climate justice and has founded the initiative called I Lead Climate Action in Nigeria. And she has also initiated the Fridays for Future movement, like the version of the Fridays for Future movement that has also taken root in Nigeria as well. But now, without losing more words, I'd welcome Adenike to give a small comment, and then afterwards I welcome all of you to share your thoughts and questions with us.
Hello? Hello. Thank you so very much. I am excited to be here, and thank you for the lecture. I brought a lot of insight from what she mentioned, and one of such is when she said, anything that cannot be measured is not a reality. And it boils down to why we have the planetary crisis today. Because we feel some of these crises are not measured, and so there is nothing we can do about it. And one of such is the climate crisis. Let me just give you a bit of what is happening there. That, for example, we have been fighting about the loss and damage funds, and so they believe that if we want to act on the climate crisis, then we have to measure this loss and damage. And indeed, some of these losses, they cannot be quantified. An example is the loss of life. You know, the loss of natural heritage sites, the loss of culture. Can you quantify them? It's not possible. But it's possible, maybe you could quantify the number of houses, livelihood loss, but there are some that are not quantifiable. And so if we go by the fact that we are going to measure realities, then we will leave a lot of issues, which brings us to the planetary crisis that we have currently. And, one of those things, again, I want to mention is the fact that the planetary crisis that we have today, because I've seen people blame population as part of the crisis that we have today, but then I have a view that even though we have the smallest population and we are not taking into cognizance all of this crisis, we are not dealing with it as a crisis, we'll still be in the same planetary crisis that we have today. And another thing that was mentioned that also struck me is the fact that, or just like a question, is the fact that until when we come to the full form of planetary intersectionality, then we could fight the planetary crisis as a crisis, and one of such is using the black feminism approach. Sometimes I ask a question, where did this black feminism try to stand, to strive or to fight out this inequality in the system? So it has been a long time struggle to see that we have this movement that seeks to fight the crisis that we are fighting right now. And I'm really grateful that we are able to learn from what you have just mentioned, and looking at it from the angle of an ecofeminism again, it tells a lot, because we talk about environment, we talk about human, that these two are not separable. Sometimes we try to separate these two, nature and human, but they are inseparable. Looking at the fact that women and nature are also connected in different ways, because I'm from Nigeria, and you cannot separate women from nature. It's not possible, and that is why when the climate crisis hits, the planetary crisis, it's going to affect women the most, and then we become the burden bearers. And when they ask me, how are women being affected? One of such is the fact that we see women trekking distance in search of water, and it's not a common thing here. You see them carrying water on their head. Imagine you carry water for like 10 kilometers or as much as that, not just once, not twice, but multiple times. It shows the burden, how this planetary crisis infringe into our world today. And the only way we could use to solve this planetary crisis is when we bring, or when the black feminism approach strives. And I'm really grateful that she was able to mention quite a number of things. And one of those questions I also want to ask is that where do we place the feminism approach? Like, do you think it could survive the crisis that we have today? Do you think it's going to wear out? Do you think it's going to be able to compete? Because people are seeing it as an outdated kind of knowledge, but very meaningful. It could really had a lot of solutions that we have for our planetary crisis.
Thank you so much, Enrique, for your very engaging remarks and for the question. Is this on? Can you hear me? Yeah, great. I don't see there being a risk of feminism being sort of removed from this conversation because of the arguments that feminism makes. I see that there's a risk of that happening because of a backlash against feminism, and we have a major backlash in the African continent, especially, but all around the world with, populist movements on the far right growing. One of just a few ways in which the feminist movement is facing huge resistance. But interestingly, there's, the same groups that resist the idea of a climate crisis are also the groups that resist feminism. So there's, so in some sense, if, within the movement, the more that we are able to see that, the stronger arguments we can actually make for the necessity of a feminist approach to these planetary crises that we're facing. And to the extent that there are alternative discussions that are happening, because it's really interesting, this time that we're living in, that even though we are still very much following the materialist approach, so even within the bodies, the international treaties and organizations that are dealing with the crisis, the approach is, it's very much about what is tangible, as you said, it's very much about the data, the technical, rationalist mode. But because something is changing in the zeitgeist, and that something is something that I believe has to do with feminism, among other things, also, a more diversifying and pluralization of voices is happening. And because of that, there is now this, as I alluded to in the end, there are these little gaps, these openings, where a different kind of discourse is also starting to emerge. So one question that I think feminist discourses has really brought to the table is that we are speaking more of a sort of interdisciplinary approach to the crises. And so you have even, politicians, when they meet in Davos or wherever, there's invitations now to younger people, to artists, but it's still problematic because these groups are invited, as something that happens in between the real important conversations that the big boys are having, if you like. And the real challenge, I think, for feminism will be to continue to say that, we need those conversations to have as much gravitas, as much importance, that the artists, the philosophers, the poets, the women, the children, the elderly need to become part of the actual decision making. And groups, of course, these are the groups that are working with the non-human, typically. So allowing for those voices to also be reflected.
Thank you, both of you. Are there any questions from the audience? And as I said, if anyone prefers to ask in German first, I can also do my best to translate, but this is really up to you. Diana.
Yes, I've read Octavia Sandals. She, beautiful shows this intersectional dimension of black feminism, and she combines it there with history. And she's also was a prominent figure of Afrofuturism. And I would be interested in what you think about it, and what can this movement can be a chance for the planet, for the future of the planet.
You read? Do you have any assessment on it?
It's a great book. I think, I mean, maybe many people in the room haven't read Kindred. Kindred it's a long time ago I read it, so you might even explain it better, but it's a story in which a black woman who's living in America, in modern day America, suddenly develops this sort of skill to somehow time travel. Or not a skill, she involuntarily is like drawn back, and she's living on a plantation as a slave. Like she goes back and forth in different eras of American history, but she has all of the knowledge that she, in her life in the 1980s or whenever the book was written. And it's amazing because it really, I mean, I think if everybody who was a decision maker read Kindred and read it to sort of extrapolate knowledge about how history is tied to all of the many crises, like some kind of subtle shift would happen at least, if not major. Yeah, I recommend it. I think I will add to that though, that even though Kindred is certainly representative of some element of black feminist thought, it of course isn't the whole gamut, right, which isn't what you were saying. That kind of thing does happen quite often with black feminist thought that, sort of gets narrowed down. And maybe I should say, to my own, or to this point, that even what I was describing tonight is of course coming from my vantage point, and the black feminist school of thought has so many different types of approaches. But if it weren't, I would be comfortable to argue that if it doesn't have an intersectional element, then it is no longer black feminist thought. So that is always the centrality in this way of approaching things.
Do you want to add something? More questions?
Thank you. Thank you very much for these interesting aspects and inputs. My name is Sibel. I'm a physician working in migration, human rights and health. I have two questions. The first concerns the systems and the knowledges that you mentioned. We have the knowledge, for example, about the climate crisis and the problems we're facing, and we also know, or we have recognized, that the systems as they are today, they were designed mostly by white Europatriarchal men. But what I'm always wondering is, where is the intention and the desire and the action of actually dismantling these systems of oppression? That's what I feel like is missing, usually, from the equation, and how do we change that? That's my first question. My second question would be, I'm a physician in Germany. In medical school, we don't learn that much philosophy, so maybe my question is very pragmatic. I was wondering about the aspect of materiality or materialistic approach. I would argue that maybe we are actually in a dematerialistic approach because we don't have any contact anymore. I don't know how this chair was made. I have no contact to the wood it came from, to the land it was produced on, the chemicals that were used in manufacturing. I have no relationship to these materials anymore. I don't know where my clothes come from most of the time. Maybe that could also be a problem, that we're dematerialized, no, not dematerialized, dematerialistic, maybe? Yes, thank you.
That's such a great point, the last one. I'll start with that actually, because I think it's absolutely true that we need actually more of a connection, sort of a sensuous connection to the materiality that does exist. And I'm not saying that materiality doesn't exist. Of course it does. The argument is just that it is not what reality is. So the chair exists, and yes, there's a tradition to how, there's jobs behind these chairs that we're sitting in, there's history to them. It absolutely is there, and we should sort of be encouraged to approach everything, material and non-material, in a more holistic way. I think that's very central to how I see it. But the notion which, you of course, as a physicist, are deeply involved with in some way, the materialist notion that it is the physical substances that constitute reality. That ontological view is the one that I'm deeply perturbed by, because I think that is where that is actually what causes us to lose the connection with materiality. Because everything that doesn't, as I said in the lecture, that cannot be quantified, which is relational, which is subjective, which is agentic, is not part of this ontology of physicalism. And so we're not encouraging that. And it's precisely what Adeleke was saying, that becomes the ultimate consequence on a scale. Because, when we talk about the chair, we're talking about the sort of more mundane elements. But when we look at it on a scale, what happens is that, we may have a sense of the quantifiable damages to environmental factors, and even those we don't care about enough, of course. But we absolutely are ignoring and neglecting or misconstruing the subjective and experiential and emotional and maybe even spiritual elements, which are, a huge part of the transformation, I think. And so I guess that maybe also speaks to the point about resisting, the knowledge. I don't know if you meant so much like from within, so like policymakers, decision makers. I think you kind of, of course there are a lot of very brilliant and dissenting people with power to shape the direction that we take. But for the most part, once you are in a certain framework, then you are tied to it. And so it's no surprise that, decision makers, politicians are not going to act upon the knowledge that they actually have, that they possess, because it's somehow, it's like it's this ontological triple error, which, in more Orwellian terms, it's a kind of double think, where you're aware of the problem and yet you keep replicating the problem because there's such a lack of incentive to think more interdisciplinarily. Really interesting questions. Thank you.
So I also want to relate with the question of climate change you mentioned, talking about, I think that is why people are calling for a systemic change, because the current system cannot withstand the crisis. And so if there is no systemic change of how we acquire knowledge or how we distribute the knowledge, it's going to affect everything. Because right now, there is still another issue on green hydrogen. And this time around, the green hydrogen. Like more knowledge, and more technology, infringing into our rights. And now we have the HAL, coming up again, combined with the climate crisis. And so all of this knowledge, there is a way that it could affect our system if we don't take necessary action. For example, now we talk about green hydrogen, and the green hydrogen, the essence of it is to also is to impact communities like mine, because what it seeks to do is to get more water sources, of which we lack access to water already for the majority of the population, and thereby more land, which we also need to the destruction of our environment. And you could see all of those intertwined systems that we think is going to bring up something like a solution. It could collapse the system because already the system is fragile. And so that is why there is a need for a systemic change that this current system cannot solve the climate crisis, and it cannot solve the planetary crisis that we have right now. And I think it relates to the Europatriarchal system of, because I saw in one of your interviews where you relate it with the knowledge, you know, Obori and Obo. And so the knowledge, trying to get this knowledge, more of this knowledge, but then you ask yourself that where does the black feminism approach stand in all of this? You know, it's lacking in our system, and I think a systemic approach, a feminist, black feminist approach in solving all of this planetary issue, like the climate crisis, is what is needed right now. Yeah.
Thanks. Maybe I just briefly chime in. Thanks both of you for all of these explanations. I'd be really interested in the question of transformation, and I wanted to ask about intersectionality, but I think I'll ask the transformation question first, because I think I'm completely on board with you that there's this challenge and that we're in this system where we end up in dead end streets all the time, and we have this massive complex web of problems. But what exactly, could you perhaps mention some concrete examples for the kind of knowledge that you think would help overcoming this? I mean, we're talking about black feminist theory and talking about intersectionality and knowledge of the more than human, and as I'd be, of course, especially interested in the roles more than humans could play in terms of transforming these knowledge systems. What could challenging human-animal binaries, for example, what role does this play for you? And also perhaps could you mention some of these, what exactly these forms of knowledges are? I think this might be interesting also for the audience, because I sometimes have a little trouble picturing concretely what these forms of knowledges actually entail.
Great question, thank you. I mean, there's so many things that it entails. It's, I guess, going back to the example of the chair, or maybe if we thought about something more mundane that we have, like maybe if you eat for breakfast, you have bread, let's say. I want to just use a very mundane example of different types of knowledges, because let's say that you're asked to describe what is in the breakfast that you have, so in the bread. If you were to describe it with the Europatriarchal materialist world view of knowledge paradigm, you would describe the amount of carbs or sugars or protein. Well, it's not a lot of protein in bread maybe, but you know, the calorific content. So everything that can be measured. But, you know, what about the tradition of the baking? You know, maybe you're eating a specific bread from guise and it comes from a tradition. What about the texture of the bread? What kinds of sounds are you hearing around you? What does it make you feel? Are you eating it with others? Non-human others, maybe are they present as well? You know, in the other ingredients that you're adding to your breakfast. Now, this is something so mundane, is breakfast, but if we were to think about something like that in this holistic, multi-knowledge way, we can then begin to apply that to more systemic, more critical issues. And I think that really is what we need to start doing, is to start looking at things, which is why I made the point of like having artists and poets and children and this very pluralistic group of people shaping knowledge content. Yeah.
Thank you, that helps a lot. So this is what you would describe as sensuous knowledge then, or maybe also looking at simple things in a complex and deeper way than perhaps.
Yeah, and allowing for those things to be seen as knowledge production. So not just something that is, you know, done on the side, that is sort of idealistic and romantic, but that actually has a knowledge value aiding us to expand our thinking about any given issue.
Would you say that seeing something as romantic is like a bad thing in general, or is it more like the way that we see something as romantic and we feel like this is not something like creditable knowledge, that we look at this is like a romantic image of nature, for example, and so this is something we want to do away with, or is that the problem, or would you say the problem is rather what we associate romanticism with?
Both, probably. I mean, because the use or the accusation of something as romantic or emotional. I mean, romantic doesn't even really necessarily come up except if you were speaking about idealism, which of course I have done a little bit. But seeing something as to do with the emotions or the passions or the senses is of course a way of diminishing its impact. But what I'm saying is that it really has a substantial and serious value to these conversations. Because we are in so many spaces, you know, we are talking about things like freedom or courage or transformation, you know, these kinds of qualities and processes, which we on some level agree that we need in order to effect change about the very many crises of the polycrisis. And yet, because these are things that we can't measure, like, you know, how many kilojoules of some essence makes freedom, or you know, what equation adds up to courage or transformation, like it doesn't work. And so we end up, the sort of the way that we approach knowledge ends up accusing these things of being romantic. And yet they are there, you know, they exist and they are essential, but they're not material.
Thank you, I agree with you. Are there any other questions from the audience?
Thank you very much for the presentation. I have 3 questions or even dilemmas, and let me play the devil's advocate. One is about intersectionality. Where do you position class struggle or classism? Is it just juxtaposed? Is it just in a horizontal order with the other aspects of oppression, or is it a special aspect of oppression in these times? So the question is, of course, very important for social movements. If you look back at 19th, 20th century social movements, you had class struggle in the center. This was the main cleavage, and this was a very specific redistributive approach to social reality, so social structure. Now you have very much identitarian movements in feminism, queer movement, etc., etc. So does it really fit together, or is there an antagonism? Is there a rivalry? Is there a conflict? For me, it's very important to stress this point of class struggle, because I observe in these days, in the United States as well as in Europe and in other places, that class struggle is kind of fading away, or is taken over by the right wing. So Trump was kind of doing what Berlusconi were trying to have. They were kind of representing simple people, einfache Leute. So this is number one, intersectionality. Is it really horizontal, or are there internal divergences and contradictions? Number 2 is about quantifying. I completely agree with you that this, particularly in the sciences, that quantifying is the essential approach to reality. But if you look at the IPCC arguments or the IPBES arguments, it's always quantifying. It's always about 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees, and there's even this call for follow the science, and that means quantifying. So what is the alternative to all this quantifying discourse? Is it storytelling? Is it more convincing to have another approach to factors like climate change or loss of biodiversity? When we talk about stories and how to handle the crisis. And number 3 is, I was very much impressed by your last word about searching for truth. But there is this Foucauldian argument that the search for truth is always immediately linked to repression and power relations. This is Foucault's argument in his books about sexuality. So is there really a realm in our thinking, metaphysical, ontological thinking, where we can really separate truth and power?
Thank you very much for those questions. Yeah, I definitely agree that, to the extent you're making an argument about the importance of class struggle, I agree that it is central to this conversation. And in fact, I would say that this is one of the reasons why Black feminism is Black feminist thought, I should say, because I am speaking of a school of thought here and not individual Black feminists, like not me underneath this. And why it is so suitable for these conversations and urgent dilemmas is because it does integrate class struggle. But what it also does is integrate gender and race struggle. And so, in the socialist movement, historically, the last two have been categories that were excluded. In the feminist movement, race and class potentially excluded. And in the Black struggle, class is typically an issue, but gender can be excluded as something to look at. It is only in Black feminist thought where, at its inception in the 70s, up until today, although I will get to some of your concerns, I think things are shifting a little bit, but it has always been about gender, race, and class. And to a notable extent also ecological concerns, because Black women also, all of this of course has to do with a kind of identity politics, because Black women have been at these intersections, so they have had to theorize around each of them. Going back to the question of alternative knowledges, for instance, Alice Walker, she writes in her book, In Search of My Mother's Garden, I mentioned this was a good example of all four layers. She writes about how her mother, who had been enslaved and thus not educated in the conventional way, taught her whatever knowledge she had to share with her, or as much of it as possible, through the cultivation of this garden. And so here you have, a kind of alternative knowledge that is critical being formed through gardening, so nature. And what is happening today with the sort of popularization of a kind of identity politics is, to some extent, it has pros and cons for Black feminist thought. It is partly why we're now seeing that intersectionality is, it's traveling into even the German government's foreign policy. But I would argue that it is that migration of Black feminist thought that is also mitigating the class element within it, the radical left politics that Black feminist thought has always represented. So yes, but it also has the advantage that, as I said, if you remove the intersectional element from Black feminist thought, it would no longer be Black feminist thought. So even if it is diluted or it shape shifts along this migration, it still brings with it certain seeds of dissent. Your question about, the quantification issue in, I think what I'm saying is it's sort of two separate things. So it's related to the question that you asked about the chair, where it's not that we shouldn't have these measurements or this kind of data, 1.5%, like all of this is extremely important. It's, what I'm questioning is the very ontological, like the flaw that is the thing that both is the problem in itself and that will also lend to the solution. That kind of thinking, and it's actually not at all, romantic. It's depressing because we are doing that, you know, where I don't think we've ever lived in an era where that, you know, it's like Europatriarchal thinking is on steroids at the moment, partly because we're coming from this post-pandemic era where, yeah, we wanted to rely so much on science that now, you know, anything that is labeled science is what we should follow, and we're sort of neglecting even more of the experiential and the subjective. But I think there necessarily is a role for quantifying in political movements, in philosophy, everywhere. But it's not the only thing that constitutes reality, is what I'm arguing. And yeah, the search for truth is, what gives me some hope is that in large part due to, you know, the technology, the internet, social media, we now have this kind of zoomed out perspective of the world, more and more, you know, in the past 2 decades, we can say. It's, you know, it's so drastically different to what it was just a decade or 2 ago, in terms of our ability to see the world from an objective, like a far objective lens. And I think that is really sort of diversifying, if not the institutions with power, then something in the social psyche. And what we're seeing right now is in many ways a kind of teething phase, which is where we're seeing a lot of like fringe movements, a lot of resistance, backlash. But in some sense, it can't be negative that we are able to see more of what reality actually is. Even if it leads to the end of the human species, which I hope it doesn't, but the truth can't be negative. That's what I mean. I today read a jarring article in a Swedish newspaper called Aftonbladet, but amazing journalism, and I'll just share this with you. So basically a group of journalists followed H&M they claim to be sort of sustainable and making sure that their clothes are recycled. And these journalists added 5 AirTags to 5 pieces of AirTags to 5 pieces of items that were supposedly going to be recycled in the green way. And to cut a long story short, these 5 items end in dumping grounds in Ghana, in Nigeria, and in Benin. And this is an example of, you know, an H&M. H&M have responded in a way that all powerful institutions today seem to respond, which is in this Trumpist way of just, you know, a blatant lie saying that that's not what happens and they believe in sustainability, when actually the very AirTags, these journalists traveled to Nigeria and they're holding the items. But this kind of zooming out, and this is of course an example just of like a story, an article, but I think the same kind of thing is happening with humanity, that, you know, that there's a simultaneous capacity and incentive and impetus and impulse to lie in the way that H&M is doing, or our politicians are increasingly doing, but there's a simultaneous impetus for truth, and technologies that can aid people in doing that. So, yeah.
Thank you. I forgot to take my phone with me, so I'm not sure how much time we still have. Thank you. Okay, so as we started a little late, I think it's time for one last question, if there is one. That's fine. Sorry, you were in my...
Yeah, one question concerning the language. What do you think, which role plays our language? I read the book from Robin Kimmerer, where she writes, I don't know if anybody knows it, But there she writes a lot about he and him, and the word the in the English language, or in German there are also it and es. So do you think there's an approach to use our language more wise to to get an impression, another impression of the world, of the connection, human and inanimate or animate things, or not things, but animal things. So do you think we have to use it more different, more wise, what do you think about it?
I'm a writer, so language, of course, I think plays a huge role. One of the most significant roles, in fact, in social transformation, in ontological transformation. I mean, language is right there at the core, at the center. If we think of, for example, something like the word sexism. It was invented in the late 70s. Imagine a world without that word. How do you describe what you're experiencing as a woman when you experience sexism? And then going back to the materialist world, where we have built laws based on the invention of it's not even the invention of, with language it's often more of an unearthing rather than an invention. It's one word, but it has transformed the lives of countless women since it was unearthed. So I think, but I would say this, and here I will confess to a romanticism. I'm very romantic about language, which is why I love being a writer. But I think what we need to keep doing is to keep unearthing language. The more accurately we can describe what kind of world we want to live in, and importantly, what kind of world we don't want to live in, the more chances we have of actually making that world happen.
I guess this is a really great final word to end the official part of tonight's evening. And at this point, I'd really thank you all for coming again. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, for your comments. Thank Minna for your lecture, and Alanike for your comments as well. And I think we can continue the discussion with a few drinks and have a nice chat afterwards. And I hope to see you again soon.